It's hard to say who invented Cubism. Later accounts highlight Picasso to the detriment of George Braque's contribution, but that might have to do more with the agenda of hailing Picasso as the quintessential avant-garde artist genius. But in the early teens of the 20th century, they worked together, they saw each other every day, and they lived in the same bohemian neighborhood of Paris. The key elements of Cubism are the rejection of pictorial illusionism, so things like the illusion of three-dimensional modeling, the use of scientific perspective, and the celebration of ambiguity in form. There's two different offshoots of Cubism: analytic Cubism and synthetic Cubism. We're going to actually start, though, back in the 19th century and just review Paul Cezanne, who was a very instrumental figure in the development of Cubism later. So he shows in the first Impressionist exhibition of 1874, and then he takes a different path, and he moves away from the kind of pastel colors, these bucolic scenes of Impressionism, and begins to recreate nature with colors, and recreate nature with these planes of color. So no longer defined contour lines, but these planes that kind of pass into one another. Something that we see here in this matrix of different geometric planes in the bay from Lastique. We also see this shift in his devotion to still lifes. He does many still lifes throughout his career, and there's always something a little bit off. He's shifting. Our perspective is skewed. There's multiple perspectives shown. For example, look at the back edge of the table. It doesn't line up. The front edge also does not line up the way we see the creases and the edges of the contour lines of the table itself. Some of the apples almost look like they're on a kind of vertical plane and they're going to just slip right off. It's a complicated scene. It's hard to understand how we would recreate this very controlled subject in actuality. He paints the same subjects over and over again. Still lifes with fruit, mountain landscape, and we can see the evolution in his work, I think, really here over these 20 years from 1886 to the first years of the 20th century, fracturing contour lines, creating this kind of slipping, this confusion between positive and negative space, between foreground and background. Who did these works? You might be surprised to find out that it's Picasso. And I'm bringing you this work of Picasso done at the ripe age of 13 to dispel one of the common myths about avant-garde artists, that they simply did not have the ability to paint or render things naturalistically, so they had to kind of revert to abstraction. I know you all know that's bunk, but I think it's really good to see these very early works of Picasso that he did to be admitted to the Academy in Barcelona at age 13. But Picasso, in 1904, he moves to Paris. He is seen almost immediately as a rival to Matisse, somebody who's 12 years older, and he begins to become very influenced by avant-garde innovations. In his self-portrait here of 1906 and the portrait of Gertrude Stein around the same time, we see this kind of flattening of space, flattening of the faces that are also very mask-like. Picasso's interested in the folk sculpture of Spain, medieval Spanish sculpture, and moves into the art of non-European cultures when we go to his Young Ladies of Avignon from 1907. And a few years ago at my neighborhood Peep Diorama contest held in spring, I did my own version of Picasso painting the Young Ladies of Avignon that you can see over here. Have to share my Peep diorama. All right, let's look at this seminal work. Picasso wanted to paint a big statement. He was aware of the importance here, and he spent a long time working on this painting, doing preparatory sketches. And what we see in earlier sketches is that he includes, amongst these fractured nude women, he initially included a sailor and a student. But then he decides to remove them. How does that change the final work? Now, in the final product, we, the viewers, are brought into direct confrontation with these women instead of witnessing a kind of separate narrative unfolding in front of us. The title here, the demoiselle or the young women, that is code for prostitute. Avignon is also the red light district of Barcelona. And these women selling their bodies, they're actually they're a little bit frightening. We're drawn in, we're curious, we're fascinated by these women, but they're also kind of terrifying. And I think that Picasso was doing this intentionally by using African masks as models for some of the faces of the women, particularly this woman here and here. He wanted to bring together this fear and fascination of the other. Women who are sexually available, but also terrifying at the same time, different and strange. So Picasso's colleague, George Braque, also begins to fracture objects and the space surrounding them, fusing mass and void in his work. And The Young Women of Avignon is often considered a proto-cubist work, whereas Braque's Violin and Palace is one of the earliest examples of true analytic cubism, with a muted color palette, the fracturing of solids, the purposefully ambiguous distinction between mass and void. Analytic cubism demands the audience to be more active readers. It gives us a multiplicity of viewpoints. It celebrates ambiguity. There's no attempt really here to give us a kind of clear presentation. In fact, Braque said in 1917, quote, "The goal is not to be concerned with the reconstitution of an anecdotal fact, but the constitution of a pictorial fact. Painting is a method of representation. One must not imitate what one wants to create." I think that is so powerful, because what we see is ultimately the goal of analytic cubism is to present a new reality, one that is different from our lived understanding of the physical world around us. This is Picasso's analytic cubist portrait of his art dealer. Kahnweiler was a major conduit to the art world for Picasso and Braque. And we see here in his portrait that we see that almost complete dematerialization between the sitter and his surroundings. We also have multiple viewpoints, different angles of the nose, the chin, the brow line, different light sources coming from every angle on the canvas. It's as if Kahnweiler hovers underneath a surface of planes. Sometimes we see bits of him, and sometimes he disappears into this newly conceived reality. Picasso said, "We all know that art is not truth. Art is a lie that makes us realize the truth. And I think he wants to point out this lie to us in very straightforward terms. So the last work I would like us to see here for this week of this module is an example of synthetic cubism, Picasso's Guitar from 1912. Picasso never went entirely non-representational, but instead he develops collage as a new medium, and synthetic cubism simply is collage. What's important about collage? Something that we kind of take for granted as an artistic medium. It collapses the distinction between the high arts, the so-called high arts of painting and sculpture, and the so-called low art of mass culture. Collage defies a straightforward categorization. Is this painting? Is this sculpture? What exactly is this? And it also challenges our understanding of reality. I mean, what is the artwork? What is real here, and what is being recreated or created by the artwork or by the artist? And similar to analytic cubism, there's a kind of play between mass and void. Specifically here, we see the face of the guitar is recessed and the sound hole actually protrudes out. So kind of switching the roles of negative and positive space here. Picasso also used non-art materials in collage. Bits of newspaper, here we see cardboard and string, things that we might think of as trash. This development of Cubism, both analytic and synthetic, relied a lot on Picasso's first encounters with African art in the Trocadero Museum in Paris. And we see many sketches in Picasso's own work of different Gribeau masks, like the ones we see here, sketches of Mbulu Ngula, those Kota guardian figures that we looked at in the last module. They seem to have inspired Picasso's first Cubist notions of radical geometricization of the human figure. But of course, this is still a very primitivist misunderstanding of African art that assumes African art is simple and primal and stalled at an early developmental stage. So we have to understand again that double-edged sword of primitivism when we think about Cubist innovations.